Take the exit. Turn right into the drive-thru.
Nope, I'm making dinner tonight.
You don't have time. Josh has practice.
Oh, that's right. I'll just get a salad.
And fries?
No, just the salad.
But salad cancels fries.
Salad only.
Fries.
Salad.
Fries.
Food noise isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. The affordable GLP-1 source that puts you on the road to successful weight loss.
Hey, can I get the...
Fries.
Salad. Sorry.
Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
This is episode 353 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here, access special insider extras, and even have a hand in the making of our show. You can sign up to find all these things at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife, and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Bates, Chair of English at University of Lynchburg. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Richard's state of mind, and he records in his chronicle that he heard Richard say, "My God, this is a strange and fickle land which has exiled, slain, destroyed, and ruined so many kings, so many rulers and great men," and that over dinner Richard then went on to tell those stories. So it's almost spine-tingling when you see those parallels.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The spectacular downfall of King Richard II, followed by the successors Henry IV and Henry V, are famously depicted in Shakespeare's plays. The life and death of King Richard II is a prequel to what's known as Shakespeare's Henriad plays, or the Henry plays, consisting of Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. Richard II is believed to have been written around 1595, and while the plays toe the line in terms of what Tudor monarchs would have wanted you to believe the histories of these men included, there are some places where Shakespeare's version conflicts with the known history of Richard II and Henry IV. Our guest this week has recently completed a book on both these kings of England, titled appropriately, The Eagle and the Heart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV, in which she tells the real history of two of the most famous, yet two of the most often misunderstood, thanks in no small part to Shakespeare, kings of England. To help us wade into Shakespeare's history plays and sort out the fact from the fiction, as well as the impact of these plays when they were put on stage for the first time during Shakespeare's lifetime, we are delighted to welcome Helen Castor to the show today. Helen Castor is an acclaimed medieval and Tudor historian. Her first book, Blood and Roses, The Past and Family in the War of the Roses, was longlisted for what is now known as the Bally-Guildford Prize for Nonfiction and won the English Association's Beatrice White Prize. Her next two books, She-Wolves, The Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth, and Joan of Arc, A History, were both on numerous Best Books of the Year lists and made into documentaries for BBC television, and Joan of Arc was longlisted for the PEN America Jacqueline Bogard Weld Award for biography. She has one son and lives in London. You can find out more about Helen and find links to her works in the show notes for today's episode. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to let you know that there's coordinating visual history content, including museum artifacts, paintings, research articles, primary documents, and all kinds of special extras related to Richard II, Henry IV, and Shakespeare's portrayal of these kings, all packed into what's known as the detailed show notes for patrons. On our show notes page for today's episode, scroll down and find the Patreon button. You can log in there and sign up to be a patron, or just use your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of our show, and all the extra content will open up so you can look through the visual history while you're listening to today's show. For this week, the URL where to find those extras is CassidyCash.com/episode 353. Again, that's CassidyCash.com/EP353. And now, let's get to the history. Hello, Helen. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
The play Richard II is considered an inflammatory play from Shakespeare's lifetime because it includes the famous abdication scene where Richard II gives up the crown. The issue of Elizabeth I not having an heir made this play a particularly spicy one for her reign and was even used by both the Earl of Essex and the Queen herself as a political statement during the Essex Rebellion. We talk more about that rebellion in another podcast episode, but Helen, start for us here with the abdication of Richard II. Is that historically accurate, or did Richard II give up the throne to Henry IV in a different way than what Shakespeare portrays?
He did abdicate, but very much as Shakespeare shows us, not willingly. This was not a voluntary abdication. This was an attempt to get Richard off the throne by any means possible, because the central dilemma of the play is one that Shakespeare himself gives us in Act 3, Scene 2, I think it is. Not all the water in the rough, rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. So if Richard is an anointed king, but the kingdom needs to get rid of him because this terrible crisis has come to this pass, how do you do it? How is it possible? And the way they go about it is he is being deposed, but he's also forced to abdicate. It's a kind of both and.
What was it about the real history of Richard II that gave his story the power to be something that would incite riots and ultimately see people imprisoned over telling it? I mean, give us some context here. This was Elizabeth's ancestor, but it wasn't exactly recent history, was it?
It was almost exactly 200 years earlier. So I think we should probably factor in that thing of anniversaries, because Richard was deposed in 1399. So the later years of the 1590s, after the play was written, we think in 1595. So this is a hot off the press sort of topical anniversary by the time you get to 1599, 1600, 1601. And the essence of the threat that it encapsulated is precisely that question. Is it possible to depose an anointed sovereign? And the answer from 1399 was yes, it is, because Henry IV did succeed in deposing and making abdicate Richard II. So for anyone concerned about the future under Elizabeth, or indeed the future after Elizabeth, because there she was, another childless monarch. Richard had no children in the 1390s. He was much younger than Elizabeth. He was a terrible king, whereas Elizabeth was one of the most politically and intellectually gifted monarchs England ever had. But nevertheless, she was aging. Her court was beginning to show cracks and factions. And the question was what was going to happen after her, which was a question she would never address. So that idea of a childless monarch who has been too indulgent to some favorites and where cracks are showing in the governmental regime seemed all too resonant to a whole number of people in the 1590s.
There is an anecdotal story about Elizabeth I that she actually said, "Do you not know I am Richard II?" Is that something that's based in historical fact, or is that a story people just tell about her?
No, it does seem to be that she was looking through the archives in the Tower of London with her archivist, and he was the one who recorded this incident, and she was looking through some of the already ancient documents in the Tower in 1601. And when she came to some from Richard's reign, she said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" And it is such an interesting comment to make, because as I say, in so many ways, she couldn't have been less like Richard as a politician, as a person, as a mind, but she saw the parallels and the difficulties. Of course, she had been caught in a very complex catch-22 about the idea of having children, because if she was going to have children, she was going to need to marry, and then what would the status of her husband be, and so on and so on. Richard was married twice and showed no concern with the fact that he didn't have any children, he didn't have any direct heirs. Richard seems to have found it almost impossible to contemplate a future or a world in which he was not the radiant centre. Whereas Elizabeth was, however vain she might be, however much she enjoyed seeing her own image glorified as Gloriana, there was a deep well of pragmatism and realism in Elizabeth. She knew what was what, whereas Richard was a narcissist who found it very difficult to engage with political reality if it didn't accord with his own internal view of what the world should be.
So we have the background in the play. One of the foundations for the reasons that Henry is able to come in and accomplish deposing Richard II is because Richard II goes to Ireland. Tell us about this historical context. Did the actual Richard II go to Ireland, and did that play into him being dethroned by Henry?
He did, and it did, yes. Richard had been to Ireland before in his reign. In 1394, he'd taken an army over there. Richard himself was not a fighter, he was not a general, but he took an army to overawe and subdue the native Irish in 1394, 1395, and rather enjoyed seeing them all prostrate themselves before him. So rather than fighting against France, which is what his father, the Black Prince, and his grandfather, Edward III, had done, they had been great warriors. He wasn't interested in doing that. He instead had, by the late 1390s, made peace with France. He'd married a French princess as his second wife. Shakespeare shows her to us as a grown woman, but in fact she was 6 years old when they got married in 1396. And in 1399, Richard decided he would revisit Ireland, the scene of the great triumph he had enjoyed in 1394, 1395, taking with him the private army that he had just spent 2 years building up. Now, the private army itself is a symptom of how much was going wrong with his reign, because why should a king need a private army? The king should be able to call on the service of his whole kingdom. That was what kingship was all about. But so the existence of this private army is a sign to us that something had gone very wrong. It's a further sign of how little Richard understood his position as king, that he had chosen to take this private army off to Ireland at exactly the point when he had left himself open to the most dangerous challenge he ever faced. That is, he had just confiscated the estates of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whose father, John of Gaunt, had just died in February 1399. Richard had promised Henry, who was away in exile for reasons we may come on to, that he would be able to inherit those lands, the greatest noble inheritance in the country. And instead, when Gaunt died, Richard said, no, I'm confiscating them, I'm taking them into my hands. He clearly felt he was now safe. Henry was in exile, he didn't have his lands, so Richard would take his private army off to Ireland. In fact, what he was doing was leaving England wide open when Henry chose to come back, not as in Shakespeare with an army and many ships behind him, but in fact just with a few household men in one ship. But the whole of England rallied to Henry as soon as he landed.
So Richard's ability to be deposed was as much a product of his own ineptitude as it was Henry's effectiveness at stepping in. It sounds like Richard sort of opened the doors there for that to be possible.
Richard absolutely opened the doors to usher him in, and Richard had also created the conditions in which his kingdom of England was desperate for rescue from the tyranny that Richard's reign had become.
I know that the concept of a monarch being put in place by God was a strongly held belief in England. I really wonder, it's surprising to me that Henry was so well received. I would have thought he would have been seen as a traitor or someone trying to overthrow the crown. As you know, during Elizabeth's reign, we see people try to overthrow her reign and they are villainized. So why was it possible for Henry Bolingbroke to become King Henry IV? And what was that process like? Was there a fractioning of the people in England where you had some people supporting Richard and some people supporting Henry, or was it overwhelming support for Henry at this point?
It was overwhelming support for Henry at this point. And the crucial thing we have to understand is how badly Richard's kingship had gone wrong. You're absolutely right to make the contrast with Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, for all the criticism leveled at her, was a monarch who absolutely knew what she was doing. Richard didn't know what he was doing. The key functions of a medieval king were represented on the royal seal. That's a very good way of thinking about it. On the one side, you have the king on horseback with a sword in his hand. The king is required to protect the realm against external attack. And on the other side, you have the king sitting on a throne with his orb and scepter as a judge and a lawgiver. So the king is also required to protect the country internally against disorder by upholding the law and providing justice. Well, Richard had never been a fighter. That had caused enormous problems earlier in his reign, but he's solved that one for now by making peace with France. Better to be at peace than to be losing a war that you're not prepared to fight. But what was going wrong in those last 2 years of his reign was to do with the internal part of government. Rather than upholding the law and providing justice to his subjects, Richard had decided now to give free rein to what he believed his authority always should have been. That is, he ought to be able to make whatever decision he liked in relation to his subjects, and then to enforce it through his will as king. In other words, everyone else had to obey the law as he dictated it should be, but he didn't. And what had happened in those last 2 years, you can see playing out very quickly in the early parts of Richard II, the play. The opening discussions, which are quite hard to follow for a modern audience, about the death of the Duke of Gloucester. The Duke of Gloucester was John of Gaunt's youngest brother. He was Richard's uncle, and he had led some opposition to Richard in a decade earlier, in the late 1380s, along with two other noblemen who don't appear in the play, the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, and two younger noblemen, that is Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Norfolk, the Duke of Norfolk. And what Richard had decided to do in 1397 was to take his revenge on Gloucester. Gloucester was arrested. He was put into prison at Calais. And then when he was called into Parliament for his trial to take place, it was announced that he died in prison at Calais. And rumours were flying, and it later transpired that, in fact, he had been murdered on Richard's orders. Now, this was a huge thing, to murder a member of the nobility, but not just any member of the nobility, a royal duke, a son of the great Edward III. It was absolutely shocking, but of course was just seeping out to begin with. And that's where you get the great quarrel between the two younger noblemen who'd been involved 10 years earlier and were now terrified for their lives, Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, each now accusing the other of being a traitor in the desperate attempt to find some sort of security in front of Richard's now apparently completely unpredictable will. And that's how you get them having to fight a duel, which Richard then stops and says, no, you must both go into exile. This despite the fact that neither of them has been found guilty before the law of any offence. This is Richard going completely off the rails now and simply saying that his nobles, and therefore the rest of his subjects, have to do exactly what he wants at all times. The law be damned. And if that is allowed to continue, and there are many speeches in the play that talk about this, there are some wonderful speeches talking about how the law and fair succession are the bedrock of anything, because how is the king except by rightful succession? If you start interfering with people's security under the law, and then particularly when he takes the Duchy of Lancaster away from Henry when John of Gaunt dies, if he can do that to the most powerful nobleman in the country, then what security does anyone have? Everyone is terrified. So by the time Henry comes back, it's not that he's been plotting to take the throne for years and years. He's not a Machiavellian conspirator who's always wanted power for himself. He's come back because he's run out of options. He's been exiled for no legal reason, and he's gone along with that. His father has now died without him being able to be there, and his inheritance has been taken from him. What recourse does he have other than to come back? But that's where you get the discussion between him and the Earl of Northumberland that plays out then in the Henry IV plays about whether he's just coming back to get his Duchy of Lancaster or whether he's going to try for the throne. In fact, it turns out there is really no choice. Richard has destroyed the whole basis of his kingship, and the whole kingdom is looking to Henry for salvation.
Did a follower or supporter of Henry IV really kill Richard II? And if not, how did Richard II actually die?
That's a very good question. The short answer is, I can't tell you, but the long answer is almost certainly it was on Henry's orders. I mean, certainly. I mean, I'm hedging my bets because I don't have a document where Henry said, please kill the king, but those documents don't tend to exist for very good reasons. What happened was, after the deposition, Henry ordered that Richard should be kept in very secure captivity, no longer in the Tower of London where he had been during the deposition process, but at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, so a long way away from the centre of power, very closely guarded. Even so, 3 months after Henry's coronation, a rebellion took place. The 4 lords who had been closest to Richard, who were scared about their own futures under this new regime, even though they too had gone along with Henry's taking of the throne, they decided they would rebel. The rebellion was put down almost immediately, and in fact, they were lynched by angry mobs rather than executed by the king, which just shows you how much support for Henry there was in the country at that point. But it's a sort of iron law of late medieval English history that once a rebellion has reared its head, it's too dangerous to have a living ex-king around the place, even in the most secure prison you can find. And so we have this strange course of events in the early months of 1400. In February 1400, Henry's council in London recorded in their notes that if Richard was still alive, he should be very well guarded. But if he was dead, his body should be brought back to London and displayed to the people on the way so that they should know. Now, Richard was only 33. Why would he be dead? But only weeks later, news came that Richard was in fact dead. In the play, we are shown a man called Sir Piers Exton taking a hint from Henry and going and killing Richard violently. Henry did have a servant, a knightly servant called Sir Peter Buckton, so there's a possible equivalence there. But when Richard's tomb was opened in the late 19th century, there was no sign on any of the surviving bones. They weren't all there, but his skull was there. There was no sign of violence anywhere. And the other rumour that was doing the rounds in 1400, around the time when Richard died, was that he had either refused to eat and died of starvation or been deliberately starved to death in his prison. I suspect the latter is the more likely. And of course, starving someone to death means they won't have signs of violence on them. If I were a betting woman, I would put money on a verbal instruction, nothing written down, going up to Pontefract to say, right, no food or water for Richard. And that was most likely how it happened.
So what does Shakespeare get right about his portrayal of Richard and Henry?
An awful lot. In terms of the major arc of what happened politically, you see a huge amount. I mean, in fact, all the major plot points, if you like, politically are almost right on the money. They're just compressed. They're compressed in time. It's as though you're watching the whole thing on fast forward. I mean, particularly the Henry IV plays. You're skipping through 14 years as though you could do it on double speed. So we know that Shakespeare was working from Holinshead, and Holinshead was working from contemporary sources. And there are wonderful moments where you hear direct echoes in the plays of 14th and 15th century sources that you can go back to. The famous speech, "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." There is a moment in the Chronicle of Adam Usk, who was a cleric being employed by Henry at this point around the deposition, who was sent into the Tower of London to report on Richard's state of mind. And he records in his chronicle that he heard Richard say, "My God, this is a strange and fickle land, which has exiled, slain, destroyed, and ruined so many kings, so many rulers and great men." And that over dinner, Richard then went on to tell those stories. So it's almost spine-tingling when you see those parallels.
So it sounds like Shakespeare gets a lot correct about his plays, but I'm sure it's not all perfect. So what does Shakespeare get wrong? What things does he miss in his telling of the play that don't line up with history?
What I would say that he gets wrong, or deliberately changes, I suspect, are the characters of, or elements of the characters of the two Henrys, Henry IV and Hal, who is going to become Henry V at the end of Henry IV Part 2. Bolingbroke and King Henry in the Henry IV plays, it's quite hard to either fit them together or to get a whole psychological portrait in the way that we do have of Richard, I think, and more so of Hal. Bolingbroke, Henry IV, is more a sort of figure in relation to, or I always feel he is. And one thing that I think affects our view of him in the plays very strongly is that he's too old in the plays. Shakespeare messes with the ages to make the dramatic structure more telling and more powerful. In fact, Henry was 3 months younger than Richard. Richard is always seen as the young one, and Henry seems a much, much older man. And in the Henry IV plays, he's the same age as the Earl of Northumberland, and Hal is the same age as Hotspur. In fact, Hotspur was 3 years older than Henry IV. So Shakespeare has played with the generations there in order to make those Henry IV plays such a brilliant study of fathers and sons and what those relationships can be. But that's not actually how the chronological ages work. And then Hal, I think, is a very interesting character, but in a different way from the way Shakespeare portrays him, because the whole story of Hal's carousing, his riotous youth, is vastly exaggerated. If it happened at all, it was for a very, 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 very brief period towards the end of his father's reign, when he was kicked out of government for a brief period. Who knows, maybe he hit the bottle at that point. But Falstaff is a fictional character with some elements of characters who were on the Lancastrian stage, but really created to be a foil for Hal as Shakespeare sees him, and then the parallels with this old Henry. Poor Henry was old before his time, but he was only 45 when he died.
Shakespeare himself, having been denied his own personal father and son story when his son Hamnet died, makes the brilliance of this father-son narrative in this series of plays very poignant, I think, in terms of Shakespeare's own story. And while his series of plays are, I think, very good for informing someone's understanding of this section of history, and I think his plays make this part of history very accessible, because it is complicated and there are a lot of moving parts, and getting to see it performed on stage helps provide context. But I do think it is important to point out that maybe because he's condensing everything to, a 2-hour play production instead of having decades with which to tell this story, he does change up some things for the sake of it being a play instead of it being a history chronicle. And it's important to point those out and make sure that we understand there are some separations between Shakespeare's version and what actually happened. But I know that we are thrilled to explore this history further, first and foremost with your latest book, of course, and that we will link to in the show notes for today's episode. But I think you are a unique expert to ask about this, because you've been neck deep in all of this history, putting your book together. So what can you point us towards? If we're new to this part of history, where should we start if we want to learn more?
Well, there are two very brilliant source books that cover Richard's reign right up to the usurpation and the aftermath of that give translated extracts from contemporary sources with a whole load of explanatory framework and introduction and so on. One is Alison McHardy, A.K. McHardy, The Reign of Richard II, and that goes up to 1397. And then there's another volume by Chris Gibbon Wilson called Chronicles of the Revolution, and that goes from 1397 to 1400. And they're very accessible. They're paperbacks, and they're a wonderful way of getting up close and personal with the key sources for Richard's reign. And then for Henry's reign, Henry IV's reign, there is a wonderful biography of Henry IV in the Yale Monarchs series, which is again by Chris Gibbon Wilson, just called Henry IV. And it was one of my Bibles when I was digging into the research for the book I've just read. It's beautifully written. It is very scholarly, but those three books together would really give you a lot to go at if you're looking to dig behind the plays a lot further.
We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, along with the link to Helen's latest book called The Eagle and the Heart. It is a dual biography of the actual Richard II and Henry IV. They are two cousins whose lives played out in parallel until, of course, Henry takes over from Richard and declares himself the King of England. It is a great book to study along with your study of Shakespeare's Henriad plays and, of course, his play Richard II. So we will place links to her book in the show notes for today as well, and heartily recommend that you check that out. Well, Helen, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I've been thinking long and hard about this because it's a very serious question, but I think if you're allowing me Shakespeare and the Bible, then I think I've got all the sort of red meat I need there. And so I've got to go for love now, haven't I? I've got to go for a book I just love and know I can read and reread. So I'm going to beg and plead to ask if I can have a series of 6, which I know you're probably going to say no, but Dorothy Dunnett's Lymond Chronicles. 6 books set in the 16th century about Francis Crawford of Lymond, a Byronic, romantic, brilliant hero cutting a swathe through the mid-16th century. Her knowledge of the 16th century is extraordinary, and her wit and intellect in writing these books astonishes me. If I'm allowed all of them, I will go to the deserted island tomorrow. If I have to pick one, I think I would have to either pick the first one, The Game of Kings, or the last one, Checkmate, because I think I need beginnings or closure. But in an ideal world, I would take all 6.
Well, I think since it's set in the 16th century and we have such a love for that here at That Shakespeare Life, we would have to allow you to take all 6 so you could be fully set up for your deserted island trip.
Then point me in that direction and I'm off. Thank you.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, funny you should ask that, Cassidy, because I need to go back to the beginning of our conversation. My next project is a full-length biography of Elizabeth I. So I'm going from Richard to Elizabeth. I have written already about Elizabeth, a very short book in the Penguin Monarchs series, just 25,000 words. But it's very hard to leave Elizabeth alone once you've got a taste of her. So I'm going back and I'm going to have a go at a full biography. And I think actually the parallel, I think moving from the 1390s to the 1590s is going to be extremely interesting and illuminating. I hope so.
That
anyway.
Sounds fascinating. Yes, we will look forward to seeing that come to fruition. Thank you so much, Helen Castor, for being here today and taking us through the history of Richard II and Henry IV and helping us understand the real history that informed Shakespeare's plays. This has been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thank you so much.
The list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with more information on our guest and how you can follow her work, is available in the show notes for today's episode. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 353. Remember that you can access the detailed show notes for today's episode by clicking the Patreon button on that page. If you're an educator in Shakespeare history looking to coordinate this podcast with your study of Shakespeare's Richard II or Henry IV. Remember that we have coordinating history content for educators packed into our Shakespeare Educator tier on Patreon. This includes worksheets, lesson plans, and even hands-on activity kits where you can try out games, recipes, and crafts from the life of William Shakespeare right in your classroom or at home. Find all of these resources right now on patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and make sure you click the Shakespeare Educator tier. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.